Before cetaceans, before mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, pliosaurs, and even crocodiles, there were the original dominant marine reptiles, the ichthyosaurs. These so-called fish lizards weren't just apex predators, they were some of the longest living lines of vertebrates the world has ever seen. And their story is mirrored in the legacies of those who found them. In this video, we're looking at the dolphin-like marine reptiles that spanned 4 periods. We'll cover their size, their shape, and how they survived for quite so long. And in doing so, we're also going to pay tribute to a woman who, much like the fossils she dug up, set a tremendous legacy that spanned ages. Their story, from our perspective at least, begins with a brilliant woman named Mary Anning. Ichthyosaurs were discovered by the most unusual of 19th century scientists, a woman. Mary Anning was a remarkable human being at a time when women weren't really allowed to be. Born into a very working-class family in 1799, she briefly touched the century in which Blackbeard embarrassed the British Navy, Mozart lived the entirety of his life, and even Sweden had an empire. Anning was one of 10 children, as was the norm at the time, and as was the norm too in this pre-vaccine world. Most of them were dead within a couple of years of being born. As it was, Mary and just one of her brothers, Joseph, were the only two to experience the 1800s. The 1700s were a dramatically different world to the 1800s, the latter being the century that ushered in the Industrial Revolution, anesthesia, and the word dinosaur. And Anning, who, fortunately for this video editor, can be played by Kate Winslet, played a significant role in this last revelation at least. Mary's father supplemented his income by selling fossil finds to collectors, and with her education being mostly limited to basic literacy, she and her brother followed in his footsteps. The coastal town where she grew up, Lyme Regis, was a safe haven for the wealthy English folks of the time whose holiday trips to Europe had become a bit dodgy in the presence of all the French being, as they were in the early 1800s, even more hostile than usual to the English. So, to cut a long story short, this is how an unassuming little girl of about 12 years old became one of the most influential contributors to paleontology and a pioneer of the craft. And Mary Anning, as it happens, would grow up and die with no idea how closely her story paralleled with the creatures she discovered. In 1812, Mary and her brother discovered a peculiar skull in the rocks. It was elongate, filled with sharp teeth, and it had enormous round eyes. Over the coming months, Mary was able to find the rest of the skeleton. It was over 5 meters long. Its excavation became popular news, with subsequent finds just like it over the next 5 years. And scientists finally concluded that this was some as yet unknown marine reptile. It was placed in the Ichthyosaurs, or fish lizard group. And this was back at a time when the very word dinosaur wouldn't be invented for decades. The specimens weren't alone, and it turned out several lesser examples had been recorded as far back as 1699, exactly a century before Mary Annings was born. These and subsequent fragmented finds confounded their discoverers, being logged as fish remains, crocodiles, dolphins, or even drowned humans. Larger finds were labeled as large lizards, but nothing made sense until 1812. The Annings find was the first complete of its kind, and it was sold for £23, which at the time was worth considerably more than £23, but still not permanently life-changing in its amount. Rough calculations show that today it'd be around £1,200, and would have amounted to about 5 months' wages for skilled labour back then. Mary Anning and her family had an intimate relationship with the sea. They lived so close to the shore that during strong storms it would reach the house, and on one occasion at least, it even flooded the lower floor. So it was fitting that it would be they who found the first accurately identifiable remains of an animal whose marine adaptations evolved in similar conditions. The fossil that Mary and her brother found on that coast, despite being 195 million years old, was not even close to the earliest of its kind. Ichthyosaurs originated on land, having descended from the amphibious tetrapods that once left the oceans over 400 million years ago. Like Anning's family, they likely showed up right at the tail end of a significant period of time, in the Permian. And like her too, they survived odds that were heavily stacked against them. The Permian extinction eradicated a higher proportion of life than any other event known, and it marked the end of a very exciting period in all. Ichthyosaurs showed up just after the Permian extinction in the Triassic, but their ancestry is still a bit of a mystery, and their rapid divergence at the start of this period suggests an origin that goes back much further. So it seems that ichthyosaurs not only survived the Great Dying, but positively thrived after it, jumping at the chance to take over niches left by the previous clades of predators. But their terrestrial ancestors still haven't been found. Early researchers into these strange animals couldn't place them well at all. They had fish-like vertebrae, lizard-like skulls, platypus-like sternums, and various other mismatched features that made them hard to categorize. In 2014, the discovery of a short-snouted seal-like marine lizard called Cartahicus gave us a clue as to their amphibious origins, but anything further back than that is still a mystery waiting to be solved. Whatever happened, ichthyosaurians erupted in the early Triassic, and their opportunism would set the pace for one of the most successful runs of any vertebrate line that's ever existed. As Mary Anning grew in notoriety, she became familiar with some giants of the paleontological world. As the understanding of the ichthyosaurs evolved, as did Anning's notoriety as a respected paleontologist. The wife of British geologist Roderick Murchison came to work with Mary Annings to learn how to become a fossil hunter, and through her connections Mary found more customers. Academics consulted with her about the geology of the coastline or to purchase items for their studies and collections. Meanwhile, the great extent of the diversity of this group of animals throughout the Triassic was also emerging. It became known that these were not fish but reptiles, but with a body type uncannily like that of dolphins, and in this way they became dolphins, top predators of the prehistoric oceans 200 million years before cetaceans would even be invented. And they were indeed top predators. They had powerful streamlined bodies, paddle-like flippers, sometimes dorsal fins. Off the back of the rise of the fishes, these reptiles exploited a wealth of seafood and a predatory vacuum left after the Permian extinction. They were air-breathing, warm-blooded, and they gave birth to live young. This meant that they were likely fast, and they would utilize a thick layer of blubber to keep their heat in, like many modern marine mammals. The ability to give live birth meant that they could remain pelagic, and they'd never need to come to the land, or even stay in the shallows, at least not for reproductive purposes. Their enormous eyes suggest nocturnal or deep water predation abilities, and it's estimated that at least one species could have used vision as far down as 600 meters. Fish and cephalopod stocks rebounded fast after the Permian extinction, and so the ichthyosaurs made sure that they were there to make the most of it. They ranged in size from about 1 to 2 meters up to colossal monsters, some of which we'll discuss shortly, and they would occupy all the top predatory niches at each scale. Many ate fish, as did the specimen that Mary and Joseph Annings found first, which was so well preserved it still had scales from its last meal in its belly. Others had toothless beaks and would feed using suction, and others still had larger serrated teeth for cutting into flesh, and so they would have eaten other marine reptiles. Before mammals took to the water, these were the killer whales. Thalattarchon saurophagus was a perfect example of a late Triassic leviathan, a 9-meter, 5-ton apex predator known as the lizard eater that killed with bladed teeth. Others had crushing teeth for smashing ammonites, and others still would have been bulk feeders of krill and smaller crustaceans or mollusks. The early Triassic was where the ichthyosaurs got their foot in the door, with eel-like undulating species to begin with, that subsequently evolved into some of the largest animals the planet has ever seen by the late Triassic. And towards the end of this period, there was nothing larger on Earth than Ichthyotitan sevenensis. And there perhaps never would be. This gargantuan animal was thought to have been at least 25 meters long, and fragmentary fossils of it or a similar species have resulted in early predictions of an animal 35 meters in length. That's bigger than a blue whale. And in a twist of fate, the first evidence for this monster was discovered in Britain 200 years after 12-year-old Anning's infamous find, and it was found just over an hour's drive from it by an 11-year-old girl and her family. So by the late Triassic, while dinosaurs were still learning the ropes on land, ichthyosaurs were absolutely dominating the oceans. But this would change. For a long while, Annings and other collectors had been recording these finds of conical objects known as Bezier stones along the beaches. British paleontologist William Buckland would discuss anatomy and classification with Mary, and they and her brother Joseph would go fossil hunting together. And so, when Anning suggested to Buckland that these strange stones might be fossilized poop, it was taken seriously. Among the culprits were, of course, Ichthyosaurs, but also other classes of marine predators such as Plesiosaurs. Because by the Jurassic there were contenders to the throne of the world's largest predators. The end Triassic extinction event wasn't enough to wipe out such a diverse and resilient line, but the Ichthyosaurs were certainly hit hard. In fact, only a handful of groups made it through, and as they quickly started to expand into new niches, so did other lines of reptilian predators. Most early Jurassic Ichthyosaurs were more modest in size than their Triassic predecessors, but there were some exceptions. Temnodontosaurus was a 12-meter beast with cutting teeth, and yet another species originally discovered by the Anning siblings. And this one would have been one of, if not the largest marine predators of the time. It's also the animal with the title of the largest eye of any vertebrate known, suggesting perhaps a deep-sea ambush predator or a giant that hunted squid in the way that sperm whales do today. And Uranosaurus, while a little smaller, represented some of the more specialized animals of the early Jurassic. This one had an elongated upper jaw, somewhat like a blue marlin or a swordfish, and a similar body type to them too. But by the late Jurassic, the time of unquestioned ichthyosaur dominance was coming to an end, and the fish lizards found themselves in strict competition with both plesiosaurs and pliosaurs. Plesiosaurs, in particular, were now bigger, meaner, and more prevalent, but ichthyosaurs wouldn't go down easily. As we enter the Cretaceous, despite a long-term winnowing of diversity, ichthyosaurs hung on and even showed some diversification in the early Cretaceous. In fact, at least 7 or 8 ichthyosaur genera spanned the Jurassic-Cretaceous boundary. They were not only resilient, but widespread and cosmopolitan all the way to the end. And all the way up to their extinction in the mid-Cretaceous, they sported some curious and specialized adaptations too. And as paleontologists figure out more about this period, their estimated diversity seems to only increase. But by around 90 million years ago, their lineage finally succumbed to competitive pressure. Or perhaps environmental factors. The question remains whether it was the rise of the mosasaurids that put the final nail in the ichthyosaur coffin, or the apparent shift in oceanic conditions around the time of their extinction. Likely, as is often the case, it was a mix of both biotic and abiotic factors. But whatever it was, this incredible almost 200 million year reign of the ichthyosaurs would sink into the mud around 90 million years ago, until it would be revived in 1812 by a young fossil collector and her brother in Lyme Regis. Anning's initial fossil find was eventually described as Ichthyosaurus anningae in her honor, but even this gesture didn't really do her justice. When Anning was a girl, the common consensus of the time was that the Earth was only a few thousand years old, and that it was created by a guy powerful enough to invent the universe, but also insecure enough to flood entire cities out of spite. The discoveries of Anning and her contemporaries made this understanding impossible to stand behind, and much in the way that the ichthyosaurs set a new pace for marine predators that will forever echo through the eons, Mary and Joseph Anning, from simple coastal beginnings, would come to change our understanding of the world forever. And yet Anning was denied entry to top universities, as well as major institutions like the Geological Society, simply on account of her sex. The legacies of both the ichthyosaurs and those who found them interweave our understanding of prehistoric fauna and ecosystems. And while Anning probably didn't get nearly the credit she deserved, thankfully she isn't entirely lost to time, and the company she kept were able to help bring her discoveries to light. Among that company was her friend Henry Delabèche, who painted the first popular scene of prehistoric ecosystems derived from Mary's fossils, Duria antica. Think about that for a moment. All of the imagery in this video so far, everything we've seen on YouTube before it, and also in the movies like Jurassic Park or Journey to the Center of the Earth, even Godzilla and King Kong, all of these were made possible because of the work of Anning. And it bears repeating, the very word dinosaur emerged in no small part due to contributions from people like Mary Anning. And the legacy of the ichthyosaurs continues too. Around 220 million years after they tried it, another group of tetrapods took their shot at returning to the oceans. Somewhere around India, around 30 million years ago, Cetaceans relinquished their terrestrial niches and took to the seas, replacing the Cretaceous successors of the Ichthyosaurs, the mosasaurs, and becoming the ocean's top predators of their time. And perhaps in 250 million years, someone will be telling their story too. That's all for this video. If you've enjoyed it, please consider joining our subscribers and don't forget to give it a like so others can see it too. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.